The morning sun cast long shadows across Interstate 80 as Rebecca Hartwell pulled her weathered Honda Accord into the Chimney Rock rest area in Nebraska. The digital clock on her dashboard read 9:47 a.m., October 15th, 1993. In the passenger seat, her 8-year-old son Danny pressed his face against the window, watching a family of prairie dogs dart between the picnic tables. Rebecca had been driving since dawn, fleeing her abusive ex-husband in Denver with nothing but 2 suitcases and the promise of a fresh start with her sister in Chicago. The rest area was nearly empty, except for a few long-haul truckers catching sleep in their cabs and an elderly couple walking their small terrier. Rebecca stretched her aching back and checked her purse, $43 in cash and a credit card she hoped Marcus hadn't cancelled yet. The custody papers in her glove compartment were worth nothing if he found them before they reached Illinois. She had to keep moving. Before we continue with Rebecca and Danny's story, I'd love to have you join our community of mystery enthusiasts. Please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It helps us bring you more incredible true stories like this one. Now back to that fateful October morning. Danny tugged at her sleeve, pointing toward the visitor center. "Mom, can we get a postcard? Like we used to send to Grandma?" Rebecca's heart clenched. Her mother had died the previous spring, and Danny still didn't fully understand why they couldn't visit her grave anymore. She nodded and took his small hand, walking toward the building where a bored-looking park ranger sat behind a counter displaying local brochures and cheap souvenirs. The ranger, a middle-aged man named Bill Hoffman, would later remember the pair distinctly. Rebecca had shoulder-length brown hair that needed washing, and dark circles under her green eyes suggested she hadn't slept well in days. She wore a faded denim jacket over a white t-shirt, and her jeans showed wear at the knees. Danny was small for his age, with his mother's green eyes and sandy hair that stuck up in cowlicks. He wore a red Nebraska Cornhuskers sweatshirt that was too big for him, probably a hand-me-down from one of Marcus's relatives. Rebecca asked about road conditions ahead and seemed nervous, constantly glancing toward the parking lot where their blue Honda sat among the handful of other vehicles. The car showed its age, rust spots around the wheel wells, a crack in the windshield that spider-webbed from the passenger side, and a dent in the rear bumper from when Marcus had backed into their mailbox during one of his drunken rages. Inside, their belongings were hastily packed. 2 suitcases, a grocery bag full of Danny's favorite books, and a cooler with sandwiches and juice boxes for the road. She bought Danny a small wooden keychain shaped like a covered wagon for $3, watching him examine the tiny details carved into the miniature wheels and canvas top. The boy's fascination with the Old West had started with a library book about pioneers, and Rebecca had encouraged his interest, hoping to distract him from the escalating violence at home. She asked Bill if there were any other routes to Chicago that avoided the main highways, explaining she preferred scenic routes and had extra time. Bill suggested Highway 30, an older road that paralleled the interstate but took longer and passed through small farming communities where a person could disappear if they needed to. Rebecca thanked him, and they walked back toward their car, Danny skipping ahead while she scanned the parking area one more time. A black pickup truck with Colorado plates was parked near the entrance, but she couldn't see the driver through the tinted windows. Her paranoia had been growing with each mile, the feeling that Marcus was somehow tracking her movements despite her careful planning. She had withdrawn cash from 3 different ATMs in Denver before dawn, left her cell phone on the kitchen counter, and told only her sister Linda about her destination. The Honda's engine turned over reluctantly, coughing twice before settling into its familiar rumble. Rebecca had bought the car used 5 years earlier when Danny started school, needing reliable transportation to her job at the county clerk's office. It had 180,000 miles on the odometer and needed new brake pads, but it had never left her stranded. She hoped it would hold together for the remaining 700 miles to Chicago, where Linda had prepared a spare bedroom and enrolled Danny in the local elementary school under an assumed name. As they pulled back onto Interstate 80, Rebecca checked her rearview mirror and felt her stomach drop. The black pickup truck was following them, maintaining a steady distance of about a quarter-mile. She tried to convince herself it was coincidence. Thousands of vehicles traveled this route daily, and Colorado plates weren't unusual in Nebraska. But when she took the next exit to test her suspicions, the truck followed. And when she doubled back to rejoin the interstate, it was still there. Marcus had always been controlling, but his behavior had escalated dramatically after losing his job at the meatpacking plant 6 months earlier. The drinking increased, and with it came the accusations that Rebecca was planning to leave him, that she was poisoning Danny against him, that she was hiding money. The accusations weren't entirely wrong. Rebecca had been secretly saving $20 here and there from her grocery budget, hiding the cash in a hollowed-out book in Danny's room. When Marcus discovered her small nest egg 2 weeks earlier, his rage had been volcanic. The bruises on her ribs were finally fading, but Rebecca could still feel the ache when she breathed deeply. Danny had been at school when it happened, sparing him from witnessing the worst of his father's fury. That night, while Marcus passed out drunk on the couch, Rebecca had made her decision. She called Linda from a payphone during her lunch break the next day, speaking in code they had developed as children when their own father's temper had made secrecy necessary. Now, watching the black truck maintain its position behind them, Rebecca realized her escape plan might have been discovered. Marcus had friends in law enforcement, drinking buddies who might have access to information about missing persons reports or interstate communications. He also had a violent streak that extended beyond his immediate family. Neighbors had learned to avoid him, and even his co-workers had given him wide berth during his final months at the plant. Danny dozed in the passenger seat, his new keychain clutched in his small fist. Rebecca had tried to make the journey seem like an adventure, promising him they would see his Aunt Linda's house with its big backyard and the elementary school with the playground equipment that looked like a castle. She hadn't told him they might never return to Colorado, that she was hoping to disappear completely into a new life where Marcus couldn't find them. The interstate stretched ahead through rolling plains, dotted with corn stubble and distant farmhouses. October in Nebraska meant harvest time, and the air carried the scent of dried crops and wood smoke from burning fields. Rebecca had always found comfort in wide open spaces, the sense that problems could be left behind simply by driving far enough in any direction. But the black truck in her mirror suggested that some problems followed, no matter how far you ran. She considered stopping at the next rest area to confront whoever was following them, but dismissed the idea immediately. If it was Marcus or someone working for him, a confrontation could turn violent quickly. If it was coincidence, she would look paranoid and possibly draw unwanted attention from other travelers or law enforcement. Her best option was to continue toward Chicago and hope that her fears were unfounded, that the truck would eventually exit the interstate and disappear into its own destination. But as the miles passed and the truck maintained its steady pursuit, Rebecca began considering alternative routes. The map in her glove compartment showed dozens of state highways that crossed the plains in every direction, roads that might offer escape routes if her pursuer became more aggressive. She had enough cash for gas and food for several days, and Linda would wait however long it took for them to arrive safely. Danny stirred and opened his eyes, looking around with the disorientation of a child waking up in an unfamiliar place. "Are we almost there, Mom?" he asked, his voice still thick with sleep. Rebecca forced a smile and reached over to smooth his hair. "Not yet, sweetheart. We're going to take the scenic route, see some different parts of the country." Danny nodded and pressed his face back against the window, watching the landscape roll past with the easy acceptance of childhood. What happened next would remain a mystery for over 3 decades, launching one of the most extensive missing persons investigations in Nebraska's history, and leaving families, law enforcement, and the community searching for answers that seemed to vanish as completely as Rebecca and Danny themselves. At 10:15 a.m., a trucker named James Patterson reported seeing a woman matching Rebecca's description, arguing with a man beside a blue sedan near the dog-walking area of the rest stop. The man appeared agitated, gesturing wildly with his hands, while the woman held a young boy protectively behind her. Patterson was tired from driving all night and assumed it was a domestic dispute between travelers, the kind of personal drama that played out in rest areas across America every day. He minded his own business and climbed back into his cab for a nap, a decision that would haunt him for years as he wondered whether intervention might have changed the outcome. By 10:30 a.m., the Honda Accord was gone from its parking space. Bill Hoffman noticed because he had been keeping an eye on the nervous woman and her son. Something about their interaction had triggered his protective instincts. The visitor log showed Rebecca had signed in at 9:52 a.m. but never signed out, an oversight that might have been meaningless or might have indicated they left under duress. Her car wasn't seen at any of the neighboring rest stops or gas stations along either Interstate 80 or Highway 30, despite Hoffman's calls to colleagues at other facilities. Marcus Hartwell reported his ex-wife and son missing 2 days later when Rebecca failed to call her sister as promised. Police initially treated it as a possible custodial interference case, a common situation where divorced parents violated court orders or attempted to relocate children without permission. However, when investigators discovered Rebecca had legal custody and was fleeing documented domestic violence, the case classification changed to a legitimate missing persons investigation with potential foul play implications. The investigation expanded rapidly, involving multiple jurisdictions as authorities tried to trace the Honda's path from Denver. Rebecca's credit card showed no activity after leaving Colorado, and her bank account remained untouched, suggesting she was relying entirely on cash or was unable to access her funds. The car's license plate was entered into the National Crime Information Center database, but no automated readers or traffic cameras had captured it after the Chimney Rock rest area sighting. Detective Paul Morrison of the Nebraska State Patrol took lead on the case, coordinating with Colorado authorities who provided background on the domestic violence situation. Morrison was a 20-year veteran who had handled dozens of missing persons cases, but something about the Hartwell disappearance bothered him from the beginning. The timing was too precise, the vanishing too complete for a spontaneous abduction or accident. Either Rebecca had planned her disappearance more carefully than anyone realized, or someone with significant resources and planning had intercepted her. Rebecca's sister, Linda, flew to Nebraska within days and spent months distributing flyers throughout the Midwest. She hired a private investigator with her savings, a former police detective named Roger Blaine, who had experience with missing persons cases. Blaine traced the Honda's path from Denver through Colorado and into Nebraska, interviewing gas station attendants, motel clerks, and restaurant workers along the most logical routes. He found several witnesses who remembered seeing a woman and boy matching their description, but no one had noticed anything unusual about their behavior or any sign of pursuit. The case attracted regional media attention, with Rebecca and Danny's photos appearing on evening news broadcasts and in newspaper stories across 5 states. Tips poured in from well-meaning citizens who thought they had seen the missing pair, but each lead ultimately proved false. A woman and boy spotted in a Kansas City shopping mall turned out to be local residents. A similar pair seen at a truck stop in Iowa were tourists from California. The pattern repeated dozens of times, raising hopes that were inevitably dashed by careful investigation. Morrison's case file grew thick with reports, witness statements, and forensic evidence that led nowhere. The Honda's description was circulated to auto salvage yards and insurance companies in case the vehicle had been destroyed or hidden. Hospital emergency rooms were contacted in case Rebecca and Danny had been injured and unable to identify themselves. Social services agencies were asked to watch for a boy matching Danny's description who might appear in their system under a different name. The case file grew thin over the years as active investigation gave way to periodic reviews and database searches. Detective Morrison often returned to the Hartwell disappearance during quiet moments, spreading the contents of the manila folder across his desk and searching for overlooked clues. Something about the timing bothered him. Marcus Hartwell had seemed genuinely shocked when police contacted him about the missing persons report. But his alibi for that crucial day was suspiciously detailed, as if he had rehearsed it. Morrison retired in 2008 without solving the case, passing his notes to Detective Janet Clark with a simple message: "This one's not finished." Clark inherited dozens of cold cases, but the Hartwell file stood out for its completeness yet lack of resolution. She periodically ran the names through updated databases and followed up on reported sightings that inevitably led nowhere. In 2018, she submitted Rebecca and Danny's dental records to the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, hoping advancing forensic technology might provide answers that had eluded investigators for 25 years. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source in March 2025, 32 years after Rebecca and Danny had vanished from that Nebraska rest area. The Nebraska Department of Transportation was digitizing old toll records as part of a modernization project, converting thousands of paper receipts and transaction logs into searchable electronic databases. A clerk named Michelle Rodriguez was scanning receipts from 1993 when she noticed an anomaly in the timestamp system that had been miscoding certain transactions for decades. While reviewing the corrected data, Michelle discovered a toll receipt that had been misfiled for 32 years, buried in a box of supposedly processed documents from the Pennsylvania Turnpike Authority. The receipt was from the Ashford Toll Plaza, stamped October 16, 1993 at 11:47 p.m. The license plate number matched Rebecca Hartwell's Honda Accord exactly, the first concrete evidence of their whereabouts since leaving the Chimney Rock rest area 36 hours earlier. Michelle immediately contacted the Nebraska State Patrol, who forwarded the information to Detective Clark and Pennsylvania authorities. For the first time since 1993, investigators had concrete evidence of Rebecca and Danny's route after leaving the rest area, proof that they had traveled over 1,200 miles eastward before reaching the Pennsylvania Turnpike system. The discovery would crack open a case that had remained cold for more than 3 decades, finally providing answers to questions that had haunted families and investigators for an entire generation. Detective Clark felt a surge of adrenaline she hadn't experienced in years as she examined the toll receipt evidence. The Pennsylvania location was completely off any logical route to Chicago, where Rebecca's sister waited, suggesting either a deliberate diversion or coercion that had forced them far from their intended destination. The timestamp indicated they had been traveling for over 36 hours, long enough to reach Chicago twice over if they had taken the direct route. Clark immediately contacted Detective Ray Sullivan of the Pennsylvania State Police, a veteran investigator near retirement who had built his reputation on solving cold cases. Sullivan agreed to reopen the case from Pennsylvania's end, pulling traffic camera footage from 1993, though most had been recycled or destroyed according to standard protocols. However, toll booth operators from that era were required to write incident reports for unusual transactions, and Sullivan discovered something interesting in the archived files. The toll operator that night was a woman named Grace Chen, who had worked the midnight shift at Ashford Plaza for 15 years before retiring in 2003. Chen was still alive and living in a nursing home outside Pittsburgh, her memory sharp despite her 87 years. When Sullivan visited her with photos of Rebecca and Danny, Chen's eyes immediately lit up with recognition. She remembered the incident clearly because it had troubled her for decades afterward. According to Chen, a distressed woman with a young child had approached the toll booth around midnight, appearing disoriented and asking for directions to the nearest hospital. The woman had a visible head injury, blood matted in her hair, and seemed confused about where she was or how she had gotten there. The boy was unusually quiet, pressing close to his mother and staring straight ahead with wide, frightened eyes. Chen had offered to call an ambulance, but the woman insisted she could drive and paid the toll in exact change before heading toward Route 119. Chen had written an incident report as required, but follow-up was minimal in 1993. She provided directions to Uniontown Hospital, the closest medical facility, and watched the Honda Accord disappear into the darkness with growing unease. The woman's behavior suggested more than simple disorientation. She seemed frightened, constantly checking her mirrors and asking if anyone else had been asking about her or her vehicle. This new information transformed the investigation completely. Clark and Sullivan began mapping hospitals and medical facilities along Route 119 from 1993, discovering that many had closed or been absorbed into larger health systems over the decades. Medical records were typically retained for decades, however, and they started with the closest facility that Grace Chen had recommended, Uniontown Hospital, now part of a regional medical network. The record search required court orders and cooperation from multiple healthcare systems, a bureaucratic process that took several months to complete. HIPAA privacy laws complicated access to medical records from 32 years earlier, and many facilities had changed ownership multiple times since 1993. However, emergency room admission records were considered vital statistics and were preserved more carefully than routine medical files. In August 2025, they found what they were looking for: admission records for Jane Doe and Boy Doe from October 17, 1993. A woman and child had been brought to Uniontown Hospital's emergency room by a local farmer named Albert Kowalski, who had discovered them unconscious in their vehicle beside a rural road approximately 20 miles from the hospital. The car had gone off the road and struck a tree, though the damage was relatively minor compared to the severity of the woman's injuries. The medical records painted a disturbing picture that suggested more than a simple traffic accident. The woman had suffered severe head trauma consistent with blunt force impact, but the injury pattern didn't match the car's damage or typical accident scenarios. She also had defensive wounds on her hands and arms, suggesting she had fought against an attacker before losing consciousness. The child showed signs of prolonged stress and mild dehydration, but no physical injuries, indicating he had been conscious and afraid for an extended period. Both patients were unconscious upon arrival and remained in critical condition for several days. The woman never regained consciousness, dying on October 22nd from complications related to her injuries and brain swelling. The boy survived but suffered traumatic amnesia, unable to remember his name, his mother's name, or any details about their journey or the events leading to the accident. Social services took custody when no family members came forward to claim him. Standard procedure required attempting to identify unconscious patients, but in 1993, the resources were limited compared to modern databases and communication systems. The Honda Accord's license plates had been damaged in the accident, and the vehicle identification number required several days to trace. By the time authorities connected the car to Rebecca Hartwell's missing persons case, she had already died and been buried in the local cemetery's Potter's Field section. The boy, meanwhile, had been placed with a foster family in Pennsylvania while social workers attempted to locate his relatives. His amnesia proved persistent, and child psychologists recommended against aggressive attempts to recover his memories, fearing additional trauma. When no family members claimed him after a year, the foster family, Robert and Elizabeth Cohen, began adoption proceedings. They legally changed his name to Daniel Cohen and raised him as their own son. Sullivan's investigation revealed that the Jane and Boyd Doe cases had been filed away as unidentified persons, their true identities unknown to authorities until the toll receipt discovery 32 years later. The Honda Accord had been impounded and later sold at auction when no one came forward to claim it, disappearing into the used car market without a trace. The DNA testing process required exhuming Rebecca's remains from the Potter's Field burial site, a procedure that took several weeks to arrange and complete. Modern forensic technology allowed definitive identification from dental records and bone samples, while DNA from Danny's childhood medical records provided comparison samples for the adult man he had become. On September 1, 2025, the results confirmed what both detectives suspected. Jane Doe was definitely Rebecca Hartwell, and the boy who survived was Danny. After 32 years, the mystery of their disappearance was partially solved, but new questions emerged about what had caused Rebecca's fatal injuries and how they had ended up on a remote Pennsylvania mountain road instead of continuing to Chicago as planned. Finding adult Danny proved more complex than expected due to privacy laws and sealed adoption records. Pennsylvania's child services had protected his new identity to ensure a stable childhood, and he had legally changed his name again upon turning 18. Through careful investigation and multiple court orders, Sullivan eventually located Daniel Matthews, formerly Danny Hartwell, formerly Daniel Cohen, living in Pittsburgh, where he worked as a construction foreman for a regional building company. Daniel had built a quiet, stable life with his wife Karen and their two daughters, ages 12 and 9. He owned a modest house in a working-class neighborhood, coached his daughter's soccer teams, and was active in his community church. His adoptive parents, the Cohens, had provided loving stability and never pressured him to recover his lost memories, instead focusing on building new ones and helping him heal from whatever trauma had erased his early childhood. The phone call that changed Daniel's life came on a Tuesday morning in September 2025. Detective Sullivan identified himself and asked if Daniel had time to discuss something important about his past. Daniel assumed it was a routine background check related to his security clearance at the construction company, where he worked on government building projects. Sullivan's next words shattered 32 years of carefully constructed identity and peaceful existence. "Mr. Matthews, we believe we've found information about your biological family and what happened when you were 8 years old." Daniel's coffee mug slipped from his hands, shattering on his kitchen floor as memories he couldn't access suddenly felt very close to the surface. His wife Karen looked up from packing their daughter's lunchboxes, immediately concerned by the expression of shock and confusion on his face. Daniel had spent years in therapy during his teens and early 20s, trying to recover memories from before his accident, but doctors warned that the trauma might have permanently erased that portion of his childhood. His adoptive parents had been completely supportive, never making him feel defective or incomplete because of his amnesia. They helped him focus on the future rather than dwelling on an irretrievable past, and eventually he stopped actively trying to remember his life before becoming Daniel Cohen. The meeting was arranged at the Pittsburgh Police Department with a trauma counselor present, recognizing that learning the truth about his origins might prove overwhelming for someone who had built his entire adult identity on incomplete information. Detective Sullivan and Detective Clark drove from their respective states, carrying boxes of files that represented 32 years of investigation, false leads, and unanswered questions. Daniel brought Karen for emotional support, and together they learned the truth about Rebecca Hartwell's desperate flight from domestic violence. Her attempt to build a new life for herself and her son, and her ultimate fate on a dark Pennsylvania mountain road. The evidence suggested Rebecca had been pursued across 5 states by someone determined to prevent her escape, someone with resources and determination that went far beyond typical domestic disputes. The investigators presented Daniel with the few personal items found in his mother's car after the accident: her purse containing their Colorado identification cards, a small photo of Danny on his first day of school that she had carried in her wallet, and the wooden wagon keychain from Chimney Rock Rest Area that he had been clutching when the farmer found them. Daniel turned the keychain over in his hands, and something flickered in his memory. Not a complete scene or narrative, but the sensation of holding something similar and feeling safe and loved. Detective Clark explained that the investigation had revealed troubling evidence about Marcus Hartwell's movements during that crucial week in October 1993. Police records showed he had filed the missing persons report on October 17th, claiming to be worried when Rebecca failed to call, as promised. However, a detailed review of his credit card statements and financial records showed suspicious activity that suggested he knew more about Rebecca's whereabouts than he had initially revealed. Credit card receipts showed Marcus had rented a vehicle in Denver on October 14th, the day before Rebecca and Danny left for Chicago. Hotel charges appeared in 3 different states along a route that roughly paralleled Rebecca's journey eastward, suggesting he had followed or attempted to intercept them. Most damning, his cell phone records showed numerous calls to a private investigator during the week Rebecca disappeared, calls that stopped abruptly on October 17th. Marcus had died in 2019 from a heart attack, taking his secrets with him and eliminating any possibility of criminal prosecution. However, financial records subpoenaed from his estate revealed regular payments to the same private investigator throughout the 1990s, payments that appeared to have nothing to do with legitimate business, but rather ongoing surveillance or information gathering. The investigator, now retired and living in Arizona, initially refused to cooperate with authorities until faced with potential accessory charges. Under legal pressure and immunity guarantees, the investigator revealed he had been hired to locate Rebecca and provide her movements to Marcus throughout her journey. He claimed he believed Marcus only wanted to recover his son through legal channels and was unaware of any violent intentions. However, the timeline suggested something more sinister. The investigator had provided Rebecca's location at the Chimney Rock Rest Area and her intended route toward Chicago, information that would have allowed Marcus to plan an intercept. The investigator stopped cooperating with Marcus after October 17, 1993, apparently disturbed by news reports about a missing woman and child. He claimed Marcus had become increasingly agitated and violent during their final phone conversations, making threats that went far beyond normal custody disputes. The investigator had saved records of their communications, including audio recordings of several phone calls that painted Marcus as obsessed and dangerous. The toll receipt that had cracked the case 32 years later represented Marcus's ultimate success in tracking down his fleeing family, but also his downfall. In his desperation to intercept Rebecca before she reached her sister's protection in Chicago, he had followed too closely, maintaining visual contact that forced Rebecca to take increasingly remote routes to avoid confrontation. The Pennsylvania Turnpike represented her attempt to lose him by heading in an unexpected direction, but Marcus had anticipated this move. Physical evidence from the crash site, preserved in storage since 1993, was re-examined using modern forensic techniques unavailable during the original investigation. Paint chips from Rebecca's Honda matched samples taken from a vehicle Marcus had rented during his pursuit. Fiber evidence found at the scene was consistent with clothing described in Marcus's hotel laundry receipts. Most significantly, the pattern of damage to Rebecca's car suggested it had been deliberately forced off the road rather than being involved in a typical traffic accident. The case against Marcus was circumstantial but compelling, painting a picture of a violent, controlling man who had pursued his family across 5 states before forcing them off a mountain road in a final act of domestic violence. The evidence suggested he had struck Rebecca with a blunt object, possibly a tire iron or similar tool, before staging the scene to look like an accident. His failure to report them missing until several days later was likely an attempt to establish an alibi and distance himself from their disappearance. Daniel struggled to process this information during multiple counseling sessions with trauma specialists. The mother he couldn't remember had died protecting him from a father whose violence he had also forgotten. The life he had built in Pittsburgh was real and meaningful, but it was constructed on the foundation of profound loss and tragedy. Karen stood by him throughout the revelation process, helping him integrate this new knowledge into his existing identity without losing the stability they had built together. The decision about Rebecca's remains required careful consideration and family input. Linda, Rebecca's sister, was now 71 and living in Florida with her own adult children. She flew to Pittsburgh to meet the nephew she thought she had lost forever, bringing photo albums and stories that helped fill in gaps about his early childhood and his mother's character. The reunion was emotional and complex. Linda saw Rebecca's features in Daniel's face, while Daniel struggled to connect with an aunt who represented a family history he couldn't access through memory. Ultimately, the family decided to have Rebecca's body exhumed from the Pennsylvania potter's field and reburied in Colorado near her mother's grave, finally bringing her home after 32 years in an unmarked burial site. A small funeral service was held with Linda, Daniel, Karen, their daughters, and the Cohens in attendance, providing closure that had been impossible when her fate remained unknown. The case officially closed in December 2025, with Marcus Hartwell posthumously named as the primary suspect in Rebecca's death and the traumatic assault that had caused Daniel's amnesia. The Chimney Rock rest area installed a small memorial plaque acknowledging the Hartwell case and encouraging travelers to report suspicious activity or seek help if they felt threatened. The plaque included the phone number for the National Domestic Violence Hotline, reminding visitors that help was available for those trapped in dangerous relationships. Daniel returned to the rest area in spring 2026, bringing his wife and daughters to see where his original life had ended and his new one had unknowingly begun. Standing in the same visitor center where his mother had bought him a wooden keychain 33 years earlier, he felt a strange sense of completion. The prairie dogs still darted between picnic tables, and the vast Nebraska sky stretched endlessly in all directions, holding both memories and possibilities in its embrace. The wooden keychain from 1993 now sat in a place of honor in Daniel's Pittsburgh home, a tangible connection to the mother who had died protecting him, and the journey that had ultimately led him to the loving family who raised him. His daughters knew the story of their father's origins, understanding that sometimes the worst tragedies could lead to unexpected blessings, and that family was defined by love and commitment rather than just shared blood. The case became a landmark example of how modern technology could solve decades-old mysteries, but also highlighted the ongoing problem of domestic violence and the lengths to which abusers would go to maintain control over their victims. Rebecca Hartwell's story served as both a cautionary tale and a testament to a mother's love, showing how one woman's desperate attempt to protect her child had ultimately succeeded despite the tragic cost to herself.